Coming up, Cam Thomas and Michael Porter Jr. are among the Nets players with the most to gain and lose this coming season. I'll dive into what they can do to help themselves after this.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets. I'm Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Thank you for making me your first listen of the day. The show is 100% free on all those great platforms. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Football season is closer than you think, and right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets. Download the FanDuel.com app to get started. And on today's show, I'm going to be breaking down the Nets players with the most to gain and lose this coming season. I'll detail how they can set themselves up for success and how their 2025-26 campaigns could impact their futures with Brooklyn. And I'm going to go in order, starting with the player who I feel has the most to gain and lose this coming season, and that is Cam Thomas, who has been the main subject of the Nets offseason, really, him hitting the first free agency of his career. And we've turned the page to September, and he remains without a contract in unrestricted free agency. And by all accounts, the expectation is that Cam Thomas is going to be back with the Nets this year, whether on a short-term offer that the Nets gave him or whether he signs the qualifying offer, in which case he'd be under contract for this coming season and then be an unrestricted free agent next summer. Regardless, though, it's clear that he is not going to get the contract that he wants, and because of that, he is a player who has a lot to gain and a lot to lose and a lot to prove this coming season. Cam reportedly wants a contract in the $30 million range or approaching that figure, along the lines of what other young starting shooting guards have gotten paid, like Jalen Green, Jordan Poole, Emmanuel Quickley, whoever you want to say, and he is not getting it up to this point. And part of that is because the Nets are the only team in the NBA with cap space, and that has limited other teams in what they can offer him. But still, we've heard about the other restricted free agents like Josh Giddey, Jonathan Kuminga. We've heard other teams having interest in sign-and trades for those guys and having interest in paying those guys. And for Cam Thomas, that has not been the case. There has been no team who has had reported interest in offering him a significant contract and, acquiring him as a sign-and-trade player. The interest around the league just hasn't been there up to this point. And I obviously think that is stemming from what he has shown he hasn't been able to do up to this point in his career. And because of that, Cam is going to have a lot to prove this coming season. I think he'll have more to prove if he ends up taking the qualifying offer, and it is a 1-year, $6 million deal, as it says, at which point he would be an unrestricted free agent next offseason, and he would, by all accounts, be leaving the Nets. If he signs that, he would have the most to prove. If he signs a short-term deal, he'll have a little bit of an extended audition period, probably 2 seasons. That's what the reported offer from the Nets has been. But either way, he's going to have a lot to prove, and Cam is really going to have to prove up to this point that he can be more than just a scorer. We've seen what Cam has done up to this point in terms of scoring up to this point in his career. It's been clear that he has elite capabilities. His efficiency has started to trend upward and was above league averages this past season on really high volume. But as has been the case since he'd entered the NBA, the questions about the playmaking, about the defense have persisted, and he's going to really need to answer those if he wants to prove that he can be a starting caliber player in the NBA and get that, contract that he wants, approaching $30 million annually. And you look at the way that the NBA has approached this score-first guard market this season, it has really shown a trend of teams not really valuing that player archetype. There's so many guys you can talk about, like Colin Sexton, the Utah Jazz having to attach a second-round pick to Colin Sexton to get Yusuf Nurkic from the Charlotte Hornets. Whoever thought that would be the case? But clearly, Sexton was not being valued that highly around the league. You look at Norm Powell, who wants a big contract, this coming offseason, and was traded for scraps for Kyle Anderson and Kevin Love and second-round picks, like pretty much gave him away for nothing. The Los Angeles Clippers did. You were talking about Jordan Clarkson, who signed for the minimum with the Knicks. You talk about Anthony Simons, who the Portland Trailblazers had a salary dump to get a 34-year-old Drew Holiday coming off a down season. The NBA has not been prioritizing, has not been valuing that player archetype. And for Cam to get that contract that he wants, he's going to have to show that he can do more than score. And for me, it starts on the defensive end of the floor, because you look at in today's NBA, there is just no market for, secondary players, Cam is obviously a player who has elite scoring potential, but he's not going to be a 1A option on a championship level team. And if that's the case, there's just no market for complementary players who can't play defense. And up to this point in his career, Cam Thomas has not been able to play defense. You look at this past season, Cam had a 120.6 defensive rating last season, and that was the third worst in the entire NBA among players who averaged at least 25 minutes per game. So the Nets have just been exponentially worse when he's on the floor. And I think a lot of that is stemming from focus. A lot of that stemming from he's obviously a smaller player at 6'3", but a strong guy, an agile guy, a guy who I think should be able to do more than what he's shown defensively, because frankly, the engagement on that end, especially off the ball, he's a little bit better on the ball this past season, I think, but still not good. And off the ball, he's just a guy who falls asleep, the want to, the engagement. It just hasn't been there up to this point in his career. So Cam's really going to have to take it upon himself. He's going to have to look in the mirror, and he's going to have to play a lot better, a lot harder on that end for teams to start taking him seriously as a starting caliber backcourt player. I mean, you look at this past playoffs, look at the teams that were playing, in the finals, you look at the Thunder and the Pacers, and there were just not defensive liabilities like that out there on the floor. You need to be able to compete, and you need to be able to be a two-way player if you want to get minutes, in these high leverage situations. And, we really haven't seen Cam play he played a little bit in that Philadelphia series. We haven't seen him play in the playoffs, but with the way the NBA is trending, players are just getting so much more versatile. There's so many more two-way capabilities amongst these guys, and Cam is going to have to show it on the defensive end of the floor if he wants to be taken seriously as a starting caliber player. Beyond that, on offense, he's obviously going to have to improve the playmaking, which has been a knock on him dating back to his days at LSU. He's been a guy who's scored at an elite level at every step of his basketball journey. All-time leading scorer at Oak Hill, led all the nation's college freshmen in scoring during his lone college season. And then he comes to the NBA. He had the three youngest player in NBA history, have the three straight 40-point games. He's averaged 20-plus in his last two seasons with the Nets, but he has a reputation as a guy that has not made his teammates better. We heard Zach Lowe earlier this offseason throughout the empty calories ball hog narrative that has, he was relaying that from things he's heard from people around the NBA, presumably some NBA front office executives. So Cam is going to have to improve in that regard. And I think that there's a camp of fans and a camp of people who think that maybe the ball hog narrative is overblown, that he's a better playmaker than people, than the media wants to let people believe. But I think the reason for that is because Cam has shown flashes of being a really good playmaker, or not a really good, has shown flashes of playmaking throughout his career. He's had some 6-assist games late. He ended his season last year with a 10-assist game. Like, there are flashes, but to me, on the film, it has looked like it's something throughout his career where it's been a last resort. He doesn't want to have to give the ball up until he absolutely has to. In those games where he is willing, is a more willing passer, they're very few and far between. And there are stats to back this up. Like, I pulled these for an article I wrote earlier this offseason. These are a couple stats from the 2023-24 season, the season before last, which was his last, full healthy season. He only played 25 games last year. During that 2023-24 season, Cam ranked 405th out of 422 players to play over 500 minutes in potential assists per 1 minute spent on the ball. 405th out of 422 players. And that stat is according to the NBA Underground. They have a good website. Go check them out. Good Google Doc with a lot of different stats. But that just shows the willingness as a passer hasn't been there. Another stat that season, he averaged one potential assist per 3.4 true shooting attempts. That ranked 345th out of 422 qualified players. So those are just stats, exemplifying that the willingness as a passer hasn't always been there. You look at last season, he posted a 13.9 assist ratio. That's the percentage of a player's possessions that end in an assist. That was 104th out of 129 qualified shooting guards. So, the impact as a passer, the impact as a playmaker, making his teammates better offensively, that hasn't been there. And the defense, along with that passing, it's going to really need to improve if he wants to get that big payday. And the ball's in Cam's court this coming season because, well, I think, how this free agency situation shakes out, whether he signs the short-term contract or takes the one-year qualifying offer, I think that could have an impact on his role. Like, I think he'd have a more expansive role, or at least the Nets would have more motivation to give him a more expansive role and a lead role if he signs the 2-year contract and they have him under team control as opposed to taking the qualifying offer. But regardless, I expect him to be back with the Nets. I expect him to have a starting role, a featured role, and I expect him, to have an opportunity to stay healthy, stay on the court, first of all, and then also round out those less polished aspects of his game and get himself to a point where some NBA teams maybe start to take him seriously as a starting caliber player, where he can get that kind of, life-changing payday that he was envisioning. So Cam Thomas, a player with a ton to prove this coming season, a lot to gain and a lot to lose, because I think it's fair to say that if Cam comes out and he puts up those big scoring numbers, but it looks the same defensively and, in terms of playmaking as it has in past seasons, I don't think his market is going to be very much different than it is right now. We got more players for the Nets. We got a few third-year players. You got Michael Porter Jr. I'm going to get into him. So touch on what those guys can do to help themselves, how they can potentially hurt themselves, all that when I continue Locked On Nets after a quick break. But before that, want to tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. The NFL season is almost here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Guys, you use FanDuel. It fits however you like to bet, players, props, building a same-game parlay, or even jumping in live action as it unfolds. It makes every game even more exciting, whether you're watching your team or just keeping an eye on your fantasy lineup. And lastly, it's quick, easy, and the best way to add a little more energy to your Sundays. So are you ready to play? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. Coming out of the break on today's Locked On Nets episode, outlining the Nets players with the most to gain or lose this coming season. I'm going to keep it going in order. I said I thought Cam Thomas was the player with the most to gain and lose. I think the guys who are next in that order would be Noah Clowney and Erik Whitehead, the Nets 2023 first-round picks. We're entering their third years in the NBA now, and it's tough to say for guys who are only 21 years old that it's a make or break season. But in terms of their tenure with the Nets, this could be a make or break season for both of these guys. I mean, if we start with Noah Clowney, he's a player who came in at the end of his rookie season, had that really encouraging two-way stretch at the end of the year where offensively was shooting really well. He showed some things off the dribble. Defensively was just a menace, had a 6-block game, really looked comfortable and, impactful and forceful on that end of the floor. And then you look at it last season, he battled ankle injuries, had 3 separate sprains to the same ankle. But outside of his three-point shooting, which looked promising earlier in the year, there really wasn't much impact there. And he's a guy that offensively, you look at his shot chart, there were questions about what position was he going to play in the NBA. He was a little bit of a tweener between a center and a forward. The Nets played him as a center during his rookie season in the G League, and then it seemed like made a pretty noticeable decision that he's going to be a 4. He's not going to be the biggest guy on the court in these lineups. And because of that, obviously, he was going to need to shoot it well from 3, but also he was going to need to be able to do some things when he's run off the line. He's going to need to be able to do some things off the dribble. He's going to need to be able to create off script a little bit and read some defensive coverages. And last year, that was not a strength of his. So even the three-point shooting, it looked really good in the beginning of the year. It really, I think he was close to 40% on 5 attempts per game over the first half of his appearances last year. And then he shot really poorly the second half. That brought him down to around 33% for the year. But I give him a pass on that because he was battling ankle injuries. He looked a little gimpy and not healthy. So the three-point shooting, I'm pretty confident it's going to be there. But outside of that, he really looked just extremely uncomfortable last year. You look at Clowney's shot chart, 70% of his shots were threes last season. That ranked in the 97th percentile among NBA big men. So he was just extremely reliant on the three-point shot, really as much as you'll say with any player who got consistent NBA minutes last season. And you look at when he was run off the three-point line, when he had to create outside of that, it was really inefficient. He shot 41.4% on twos. As a player who's close to 6'10", he shot 58% at the rim. That ranked in the 7th percentile among NBA big men. So Clowney's ability to put the ball on the floor, his ability to, look comfortable making defensive reads, look comfortable handling the ball, look comfortable finishing through contact and playing with force for a player who has a little bit of a slighter frame, that's going to be huge for him. And that goes also on the defensive end of the floor. You looked at the impact that he had at the end of his rookie season in those games, and then you look last season, it really dropped off. He blocked 0.7 shots per 36 minutes last season. The Nets were a negative defensively when he was on the floor. He looked like he was getting beat at the level. He looked like he wasn't really challenging much as at the rim. The overall impact just wasn't there. And I think a lot of that is going to come from him getting healthy, obviously, not dealing with ankle injuries, but also in the beginning of the season last year, it wasn't really there. So I think him bulking up, him being able to play with force, him being able to hang physically with NBA level players is really big. And, for Noah Clowney, he's entering his third season. The Nets are, you get that 4-year contract as a rookie first-round pick. The Nets are going to have team options on him. They already exercised the third year, but they're going to have team options on him in the fourth season and beyond. So it's getting to a point where he's going to have to show something soon to convince the Nets that he should be a part of their long-term future and that he is a rotation caliber player in the NBA. And moving forward, the same thing goes for Dariq Whitehead, who's also entering his third season and hasn't had as much of an NBA role as Noah up to this point because he was obviously battling injuries, had the 3 lower leg surgeries, dating back to his freshman season at Duke. But Dariq had a healthy offseason last year to get his body a little bit more right, to get consistent. And he got, a lot of minutes. Most of them came in the G League last season. But you look at what he did in the G League last year, obviously it was his first, pro season where he was playing consistently. He averaged 12.6 points on 40% shooting over around like 25 G League appearances. So, 12.6 points on 40% shooting, that's nothing to write home about for a guy who was a first-round pick, playing against G League competition. So I think while he had some encouraging games, like I went to the G League showcase in Orlando, got to see Dariq play and a lot of the other Nets guys. And, for much of that showcase, like Dariq just looked like another guy out there. He didn't look like a guy who was standing out. And then you look at what he did when he got the call up to the NBA. He shot really well from 3, shot in the mid-40s, across like 20 NBA appearances. But outside of that, he didn't really do anything. And, physically, he didn't really look the part out there on the floor. He took 96 field goal attempts with the Nets last season in the NBA. 74 out of the 96 were 3-point attempts. So like Clowney, was extremely reliant. He didn't look like a guy who could, put the ball on the ground, who could beat guys, who could get downhill, touch the paint, or get to the rim. And a lot of that was due to what looked like there was a lacking amount of explosive athleticism there. And obviously that's something that's going to follow you when, you've had all these lower leg surgeries and you've had so much time that you haven't been able to work out, play in game settings and do all those things. But you look back at what Dariq did, what made him a top 3 recruit in that class of 2022. He was a high flying player. He had some, prolific highlights and dunks and, was a guy who looked like he had some explosive athleticism. And up to this point, that just hasn't been there, and a lot of that has to do with him needing to get back into form, get his body right. But now we're getting to a point where he had last offseason with no injuries. He had all of last season with no injuries. And he had, was healthy this offseason with no injuries. Obviously didn't play in summer league, had a little bit more time to get his body right, work on his explosiveness, work on his skill work and, the things that he does on the court. So, it's going to be put up or shut up time. I would expect Dariq to have a role in the Nets rotation this year. Do I think that he's going to be like a top rotation guy from day one? Probably not. Is he even in the rotation at the start of the year? Probably not, but I would expect with the Nets having a decision on him, in the near future that they would look to get him NBA minutes this coming season, especially after they spend a 2023 first-round pick on him. So Dariq Whitehead and Noah Clowney, 2 more guys who have a lot to prove and 2 guys that the Nets are going to face a decision on in the very near future. We got 1 more player in Michael Porter Jr. who's coming into a new situation and has a lot to gain, I think, potentially, if it goes well. So I'll touch on what fans should be looking for from him after a quick break. But before that, we have an important request. Locked On wants to hear from you. We put together a survey to learn more about our listeners and make your favorite podcast even better. This is your chance to tell us what you like, what you don't, and answer questions about our advertising. Go to lockedonpodcast.com/survey to get started. Everyone who completes the survey will be entered for a chance to win 1 of 10 $100 Amazon gift cards. Again, that's lockedonpodcast.com/survey. You can also find the link in the show notes. Thank you all for helping us out. Coming back from the break, closing out today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about the Nets players who I feel have the most to gain or lose this coming season. Last player I'm going to be hitting on is Michael Porter Jr., who the Nets brought over in that trade for Cam Johnson earlier this offseason. And the headliner of that deal was obviously the unprotected 2032 first-round pick that the Nets got, which is viewed as a premium asset, and rightfully so, but also the Nets bring over Michael Porter Jr., a player who is a similar archetype to Cam Johnson and is also 2 years younger and has, the youth and the potential to be a part of the next iteration of the team or to be an asset that they could flip with him having 2 years left on his contract. And Michael, MPJ is going to be stepping into a role that is vastly different from what he did in Denver. I think he'll do some of the same things, but he's going to be asked to do things that he's never done before. Like, that's a direct quote from Jordi Fernandez at Summer League talking about MPJ, who he obviously has experience with, coached him in Denver. Jordi said he's going to be asked to do things that he's never done before in terms of the type of shots he's going to take and the different things that he's going to be doing offensively. MPJ talked about it, and he said that he's excited for it. He said that he feels that he's sacrificed in Denver, having players like Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic there. He said we had guys behind them like him and like Aaron Gordon who had to sacrifice and who had to take a little bit of a step back, and that he said he was excited to expand his game with the Nets, and he said he felt like he has more left in his tank offensively that he wasn't getting to show in Denver, and that he's going to get to do that with the Nets, obviously, because you look at this Nets team, they're just lacking shot creation. They just don't have it. They have a lot of rookie ball handlers, and Cam Thomas, whose role, is somewhat in question because of the contract situation, is their only other high-level shot creator on the roster. So MPJ is going to be asked to do a lot of that stuff. And when he was asked, what he's expecting to do that he hasn't done before, off the heels of that Jordi Fernandez quote, he said, ISO scoring, pick and roll ball handling, some different sets and actions that they're going to be calling for him, as opposed to doing a lot of the spot up things that he did in Denver. And if he can do that stuff and he can do it at a high level, he obviously has a lot to gain. It could potentially lead to him being viewed a little bit differently than how he was viewed in Denver. But it's going to be different because you look at the numbers of what MPJ did with Denver last season from an ISO perspective. This is according to NBA.com stats. MPJ had 19 ISO possessions the entire season last season. So that's just obviously minuscule sample size of ISO possessions. It's just not something that he did. Do I think that, he's going to be the level of Cam Johnson, who I think really expanded his game and showed what he can do a lot more last season and had the best season of his career? I think from a shot creation standpoint, from a passing, a playmaking standpoint, I think Cam Johnson is a little bit ahead of Michael Porter Jr. just in terms of handle, in terms of processing the defensive coverages and decision making. But this will be MPJ's chance to show that he can do that. Also, you want to talk about, being a pick and roll ball handler, doing some of those things. You want to talk about zoom actions and Chicago actions where they're running him off, a pin down and a DHO, all those sets. MPJ last season had 55 possessions as a pick and roll ball handler. Very small sample size, but on those, he shot 44.4%. The Nuggets scored 0.89 points per possession, which is not very good, but obviously just a very minuscule sample size, 55 pick and roll ball handler possessions. That's not even one per game. So it's going to be something where he's going to have a runway to do it. He's going to have a runway to get more comfortable doing it. And it's a situation where the Nets are a tanking team this coming season. So if he doesn't do well, there's not a ton of pressure on him there. But I do think that if he can do those things well, if he can be a little bit more of a self-creator, if he can be a little bit more of a pick and roll ball handler and a facilitator, and he can add that onto his elite spot up shooting as a guy who's 6'10", I think that could lead to him having, a little bit of a rehabilitation of his value. And he is a guy who has his contract expiring in the near future. I mean, the season after next, he's going to be an expiring player and he's going to want to get another big contract. So MPJ doing these things that he's doing offensively is going to have a chance to showcase that maybe he can have a little bit more of an expansive role and that he can be a player who is relied upon to do those things offensively. And that obviously could lead to him getting another really big payday if he could be efficient in those areas. He's also going to be stepping into really a leadership role for the first time in his career. He's the second oldest player on this Nets team in terms of the players who have the most responsibility on the court. I think he's the oldest, in correlation with age and also the role. I think that he's going to be the clear-cut leader in that regard. And that could be interesting to some people based on, the things that he's had to say this offseason. But everything that I've heard from people in Denver is that he was a joy to have, in the locker room there. He was a really good guy to talk to from the media's perspective. So the leadership, the on-court role, it's going to look a lot different for MPJ, and it's an opportunity that he really hasn't seen up to this point in his NBA career. And with him, stepping into a new situation with the Nets team that is looking to rebuild and looking to latch on to some new, core guys, and also him having the contract that is going to be up in the near future, there is a lot to gain potentially there for MPJ. So those are the Nets players who I feel have the most to gain or lose this coming season. That does it for this episode of Locked On Nets. Hope you guys really enjoyed it. If you do not already, subscribe to Locked On Nets on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you enjoy the content, take 1 second for me, smash that like button, leave a comment. Let me know what you think about Cam Thomas, the third-year guys, MPJ, any of them, what they could do to impress you, what your expectations are for them. Anything that you can do to engage really helps the algorithm as I try to grow this channel, so I really appreciate that. But we're moving on further into September. As I've said, training camp is going to be around the corner, so I'll have more to talk about on all that when I'm back tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.